So let's take a look here at conceptual masses and the conceptual massing environment. First of all, to get here, when you're in Revit, you just go to New, Conceptual Mass. And this is a template, which you will see is kind of, there's only one template in here, so you don't really have a lot of choice. Um, it's kind of oriented towards making a building, so it's pretty large. And what you'll see, there's three reference planes in this view. Um, we could absolutely make these smaller for our project, especially if you're doing really anything that's an interior element. They're probably not going to be hundreds of feet. But I can also just copy one of these levels by holding down the Alt key and clicking and dragging, or I'm sorry, the Control key. And what you'll see is these are levels like you would see in any project. So I think I'm going to make my project about 10 times what you would normally see, just because when you draw in Revit, you may have noticed it's very dependent on the scale. See how we're at 16th inch scale, and I can change the scale, and that alters the way the line weights behave. But basically, with this conceptual massing tool, it's a lot easier to just draw things a little bit bigger, especially in this case because we're not going to be rendering them in a realistic environment. If you were drawing things an interior element, you'd draw them a lot smaller. Anyway, to draw on any reference plane, you just use the modify command and double click on that reference plane, and it becomes the current reference plane. And what you might see, a lot of this is going to look very similar to massing, say, in the main version of Revit. When you mass in place, you can draw a shape on that plane, and you can select it, and then create a form. And by the way, those forms can be either solid or void. Okay, and like in the regular kind of mass in place version of Revit, you can control the shape if it's a void, or I'm sorry, if it's a sphere or a tube. The other thing that you can do here that's a little different, though, is you can draw on different planes. So let's say I click on this plane here, and I go, and I'll go to the top view here just for the sake of it. I can draw shapes on different planes. I'll just draw a rectangle up there. And when you hold down Shift and click and drag your scroll wheel, you get the orbit mode, just like you do in regular Revit. Now I have two shapes. Whoops, I don't want a third one. And I can do essentially a swept blend. I can select these two objects and create a form. Okay, and what Revit will do is it will sort of figure out what you need to do to connect those two shapes geometrically. You see how it goes from a curve up to a straight line. So these are really great ways to draw elements. Just because you can create multiple planes, work planes here, reference planes, and then draw on any of those planes and create kind of different profiles as you go. Now, when you have a shape like this, by the way, it is possible to kind of create divisions vertically. Those are called profiles. And if I select the shape and click the Add a Profile button, what you'll see is that it will now divide this object up. So let's say I want to, I don't know, fiddle around with the top here to create a slightly different shape. I can select the top, and to do that, by the way, just like in the regular Revit model, if you hold your mouse over an edge but hit Tab, it will scroll through different options. And I'm hitting Tab to go from a line to a whole object, in this case a face. When you do that, in the conceptual massing environment, you get what's called a gizmo. And I'll leave my mouse over for a second, just so you can see. It says drag to change form. Toggle the spacebar to do coordinates if you want. So you see how I can warp this object, and these planes are not glued to a reference plane, so I can move it up and down in addition to left and right. I can come back in and add a new profile, add it in a different location. There's no kind of limit. The only trick is that as you modify these shapes, and I can create kind of a curve that comes back on itself. As you modify these shapes, you do have to be careful because you can create geometry that causes Revit to basically freak out, creating something that bends back over on itself, for example. Revit will basically give you an error message. So my advice is if you're kind of sculpting using these tools, do it slowly. Do one step and see what happens. Now, other things that you can add to the shape, you can also add an edge. So if I click the Add Edge button, now it will add essentially a vertical edge to this. Oops, I think I messed up. Let's try that again. Click my shape, click Add Edge, and we can add essentially a new vertical subdivision here. I'm trying to get my preview cursor to show. It's a little light, but there we go. It shows a little better. Now I've added an edge. Now you might say, why do I need an edge? Well, in the conceptual massing environment, you can move any number of pieces. I could move just a line, okay, and it alters the shape, but I can also just move a point. You see how my gizmo shows up, but it's slightly different than the other gizmos. I can actually move that point in any number of different directions, and what Revit will try to do is warp the geometry. It's kind of like an auto fold, like in SketchUp, and it will try to make that shape happen. Okay, and again, you can grab these points if, like with other shapes, you are trying to grab the point and it's not misbehaving. Use that Tab button until you find the point. There we go. There's my point. And again, I'll try and drag that out. So you can create some really interesting shapes that way. Very organic. Now you might say, well, okay, that's fun. What else can we do? Well, one thing that you can do, you can draw on any reference plane. You can also, by using the Set Work Plane button, you can draw on any flat surface that is available. You see how it highlights this flat surface here? I can move my mouse over this surface and it highlights that. What it does not do is allow you to draw on a curved surface. It basically says, I'm sorry, I can't help you in that particular area. And here we'll just draw a different kind of shape over here. And once you draw on the surface like that, you can now create forms of various sorts. And of course, these forms are available for editing in any number of ways, and you can draw on other parts of that form. Another fun thing that you can do is you can take any individual piece, and sometimes, although not always, you have other editing tools available, including rotate. So if I rotate this, I can get a very interesting twisted form. And scale. Again, each of these tools, when you do them, it may or may not cause Revit to have an absolute cow. Okay. Anyway, so you can create a shape that is pretty interesting and pretty unusual, very geometric. Now, what about if we want to add, say, parameters for materials? Well, this is just like any other Revit family. You can select individual faces, or is probably most useful in this project, select whole pieces. You can see how this piece that I've selected here, it actually treats it as a different one. I would have to use the Join Geometry tool if I wanted it to all be one, but they will work just fine in this way. Basically, what we need to do is create some kind of parameter for this material. So to create the parameter, first of all, we need to go to our Family Types menu. And this menu should look familiar from creating other kinds of families. And we'll just make a new parameter, and we'll call it material, and which is obviously very clever. And then it should be a material parameter. You actually, it doesn't have to be, but you know, it's probably easiest. So now when we do that, we can assign a material in advance if we want. If there's something in here, say glass or any other material. There aren't a whole lot of materials in here. What I might do is wait until I get to the main model when I load these families into my main model, and then I can handle the materials there. So click OK. And again, like other objects, other families, you can apply all sorts of parameters, including dimensional parameters. Now I'll show you a few more ways that you can draw things here in your conceptual massing environment. I'm just going to make the ground plane the active work plane. First of all, like I showed before, there are the usual kinds of shapes. You can also draw kind of squiggly lines or zigzag lines. In this case, it's a kind of spline. The only trick is when you create objects like this, you have to be careful. These can be extruded, okay? And you can actually really create some very interesting shapes here. When you extrude them, either edge, either profile becomes available for editing. So I can warp this in a lot of really interesting ways. The only problem is that this will not 3D print. It will not 3D print because there's no thickness. Isn't that sad? So a shape like this is just not going to work. But what you can do, you can come in with a line. Just make sure you're using the endpoint to endpoint connection. What that does, that fills this in and makes a continuous loop. And many things in Revit like these continuous loops. And now I can create a form, again, solid or void. What you'll see is that the object now looks actually solid, right? There's a top to it. This is a form which you can 3D print quite easily. I do find that for other types of activities, it also is nice if you wanted to do a chair or something like that. Getting that profile to be a continuous loop is handy. Now, what else can you do? Well, the other thing that is actually quite powerful is you can draw unusual shapes, kind of squiggly lines, pieces of spaghetti, that sort of thing. I don't know how frequently spaghetti is used in people's projects, but you can do this using what's called a 3D spline. And the way that works, you click the 3D spline tool. I have made this vertical plane my reference plane. Okay, and I'll just create a couple of squiggles here. You can double click or hit escape to end it. And this is an object, and you might say, well, great, it's a squiggly line. Well, it's a squiggly line which can be modified in 3 dimensions. Each of these points can be moved off the kind of axis of the object. Sometimes you have to hit tab to grab the object. You can also use a selection window to grab these individual kind of nodes. See how it will grab it. And now what you have is really an object which is warping in multiple dimensions. Now you might say, well, that's great. What can I do with that? Well, the simplest thing you can do, you can draw lines that are on these nodes. All you have to do is click the Set Work Plane button. Click that now. And you see how as I mouse over that node, it gives me a reference point. Now what happens when I go to, say, draw an object, I'll just click on this endpoint and draw a circle. It's drawing it perpendicular to that point in the line. So by just selecting the object and the path here, we can turn them into a shape. I'll just select the objects and hit create form. Again, like before, you can make this into a void form if you want. Okay. So that's great. But what else can we do? Well, let me just dissolve this guy back to its original constituents. Well, you can draw on any of these reference planes. Right now, when I dissolved it, it puts another circle at the opposite end. I can take that circle. Here, we'll just draw a new one. I can set that endpoint here as a reference plane and draw, say, a new circle. Oops. Draw a new circle. I'll make it a little bigger. And let's see what happens when we turn that into a form. Oops, I don't want the circle there. Let's select these objects and create a form. And you can see that now I have kind of a, I don't know, horn-shaped form. And I can even draw on some of these interstitial points. You can see somehow one of my points has become detached. I'm not quite sure how that happened. But anyway, let's draw on one of these other interstitial points here. And maybe this time I will draw a rectangle. Okay. And I tend to draw around the node. Just partly it helps me to know where I am in 3D space, but it also makes life easier. When you want to combine things, you have more predictable results. And now you can see I have some shape that goes from kind of a circle to kind of a square to kind of back to a circle again. Okay, and of course you can continue on this line and create different profiles at all of these points. So really, there are a lot of interesting shapes that can be created. In fact, I posted to Canvas a spring-like shape for a spiral. Kind of come up with some ideas for some legs in my bus stop, and also maybe some kind of bird head based on my sketch. But the last thing that I'd like to do is make some kind of wing. And here I've created a shape that's vaguely wing-like, and I don't really know what I want to do with it. Let me just show you what it looks like if I dissolved it. It's a series of circles or ovals, whatever they are, that I've rotated slightly to make it a more interesting shape. And there's other, I could tweak this some more and twist edges. The other thing that you can do with a shape like this is if you want to create, oh, I don't know, say some holes in this object, you could create some void forms. Like we saw before, void forms need to be continuous loops. So I could draw a single shape like this. And I believe I'm drawing on the ground. Yep. It's sometimes hard when you get rotated around. When you create a void form, what you'll see, just like in regular old Revit models, that your form is an object which is, a shape. You can modify it using any of the tools that we have looked at so far. And it does kind of do, I don't know, what I would consider to be kind of a lame job of showing you what you're going to get when you do that. These void forms, like other massing kind of forms, can be selected either points or the entire thing, and they can be dragged around like that. And again, you'll want to see what your overlapping shapes look like. And then once you've got it the way you want it, you can use the cut geometry tool. And it tells you down at the bottom, select what you want to either be the cutter or the cut E, and it will cut the shape. Isn't that nice? Now, as is typical of Revit, where's the void if I want to change it? You can paint these interior surfaces, but how do you get that void back? Well, one way is just use a crossing window to get the object. It does tend to get everything else. The other thing you can do is hit Tab, and often you will find that void form by hitting Tab. You see how now I can come back in and I can make changes to the void form, just edit it, and now I could say modify this profile or something like that. And when you click check, it modifies the void form, and then clicking off the void form shows you what you've got. And all of these conceptual masses, once you've created them, they can be painted right here in this particular view. Obviously, you'll want to use a paint color that makes sense for your project. What I tend to do, when I'm using this massing environment, I tend to just be kind of making shapes. So I will tend not to just paint individual surfaces, but here I'll show you what it looks like. I tend to paint the entire object. See how some surfaces will get painted and some will not. I'm going to undo that so I can show you the next portion here, which is once you've created these forms, and actually, I don't think I like that. I don't think I like that void in there. I'm going to avoid that void or negate the void. I don't know what the right term is. Anyway, the other cool thing that you can do with these conceptual masses, and this is part of a whole area of architecture called parametric modeling or parametric architecture, where you're basically taking a shape or some other object and using mathematics to help you generate kind of the form of the object. Now, this is supposed to be a wing, and right now it looks really smooth, so it's kind of it looks too much like an airplane. So what I want to do, I want to apply sort of feathers or something, featherish sort of things. And the way that I can do that, I'll select my shape and I'll choose this divide surface button. Okay, and what this does, it will put a grid on the surface or surfaces, depending on the object. Now, in this case, you can see it's actually applied grids to the ends and to the top and the bottom. And each of these can be selected independently. You can also delete them, and we'll bring your form back. What you can do is, with that grid, it essentially allows you to apply patterns to that grid. The simplest thing to do, right now it's just a transparent grid, I could just add rectangles to it. And you see what it does is it takes a rectangle component, which is a special kind of component, and it applies it across whatever shape that grid is. And there are all sorts of different patterns here. For example, I could use a checkerboard pattern. This is shadows in that checkerboard pattern. And there are so many ones. There are arrow shapes. There are octagonal shapes that are rotated. And all of these are very dependent on your grid spacing. So if you change your grid spacing, let's say I change this to 24, see how it alters the pattern. And if I change this to some other number, 36, for example, see how it smooshes the pattern down. Okay, so sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. Let me go back to where we were here. Just hit undo a few times. So we undo our grid pattern. What I think is the coolest thing is you can create your own kind of custom grid object, grid component. When you do that, you go to the Revit button and choose New Family. Okay, but you need to use a special kind of family. I'll just scroll down till I get to Generic Model Pattern Based. What you'll see in the little preview here is there's actually a funny blue grid, kind of like this blue grid, with a bunch of dots on it. So I'm going to open that up. And what you'll see here, this pattern is basically what Revit uses to apply whatever geometry you create. It takes this pattern and it applies it to your grid. Now, one thing to be aware, if I say take this pattern and let's just say I want a simple form. Okay, so I'm going to select, this is the kind of definition of the pattern here. This is kind of nodes which are locked onto the grid. I can use that shape and create a simple form, create a little box. Okay, and what you'll see, it's locked. It is locked to that grid. Okay, and this is a little tricky because what happens is when it's locked, and I'm just going to save this onto my computer here, and we'll just call it rectangle for feathers or something like that. Okay, click save. And then I'm going to load it into the project. And what I'll do here, I'm going to tile my windows so that you can see the effect of changes on these different elements here. So I'll select the top grid here. And when I go and choose from the drop-down list, what you'll see is when you create a new pattern, it does not give you a little preview. I don't know why. There's probably some button somewhere that I need to check to make it give you a preview. But anyway, I'll choose rectangle for feathers. And what you'll see, it'll take a minute for Revit to apply this geometric element to my project. But now, instead of a flat pattern, I actually have geometry here. You see how these are all individual pieces. Now, when you use a generic pattern-based component, you do have to, if you want to do anything custom, you have to think about geometry a little bit and dimension. First of all, when I just use the pattern-based grid here and create my form, and it's locked. It is locked to the grid, so whatever my grid spacing is, if I come here and I change my grid spacing to some other number, what you'll see is that the pattern adapts. It is an adaptive setting. If I change my spacing, it'll squish down these components, this pattern-based component, to fit, even though it looks like a square here. That's great, except what if I want to make an unusual shape? Then I'm going to have to draw something which is not locked to my grid here. To do that, here, let me see if I can get this guy to go away. Then you run into a spacing issue. So let's say I want to draw something that is, I don't know, feather-like. Here, we'll draw kind of an oval shape here. There we go. I'll start it on the edge of this component, and I'll select it and give it some depth here, give it a little form. Okay, maybe that's a little bit too much. Well, what's going to happen, because this object is not locked to the grid, it's not locked to the sort of reference grid. In fact, oh, it looks like I drew it up above the reference grid, which is kind of silly. I should have set that grid as my current work plane. But it actually doesn't matter. You can use any work plane that you want. You can warp these objects. You can create voids. What will happen is when this component is inserted into this model, it will retain whatever dimension this is. You might say, but I don't know what dimension it is. This dimension, first of all, this grid is a 10-foot square grid. I'll show you over here in the Properties menu. So this object is 10 feet square. Okay, and you can come in and you could put in a dimension on it, right? Depending on which work plane we're in. We're not in the right work plane. We'd have to be in a vertical work plane to do that. And in fact, you can put in dimensions with parameters in them. Anyway, when I save this object, and I'm going to load it into my project, and I'll overwrite the existing one and all its parameter values. What you'll see is that it takes the shape that I created, and it is now kind of marching it out over the grid pattern. Everywhere it finds a grid cell, it puts the exact same shape in there. And this can be good, or this can be bad. Now, I kind of like the way my warped form creates kind of a wing-like, overlapping feather pattern. If I didn't like that, or I wanted to modify it, I would have to come back here to this object, and start making further parametric kind of changes to it. And again, there are most of the same editing tools that are available. Let's say I wanted to have, I don't know, more of a wedge to it. And again, you save it, and then you load that guy into your project. Overwrite the existing parameters, and like magic, it should alter the form. Okay, maybe I want to go the other way. I don't know. Again, you would use this as a design tool. That's the biggest part, is to try and create something that is interesting and cool, and also, like most architectural things, has a pattern.
So another fun thing that you can do with your cool conceptual mass is you can set up some parameters. If I go here to the Family Types menu, which is the menu we've used in the past to do things like set up families, I can create a new parameter here. Sorry for the small buttons. And I can call it leg material. And the big thing is, choose the correct grouping. This just determines where it shows up in the menu. And click OK. And then what that means, like the default value is just like whatever it was, but you can come in here and make some new material. I'll choose leg material, and OK, and that becomes the parameter associated with that the element associated with that parameter. And then you just select the objects that you want to have that parameter, and see how it has the material here. We can come in and we can assign the leg material as the parameter. Okay. The other thing you can do, of course, and you see it takes that material. You can also just select the object and give it a material directly instead of using a parameter. Either one will work. But then save the object and load it into your main Revit model. You can also assign parameters. If you make a new parameter, you can also assign parameters that are length, and these are the things that you associate with the dimension string. Again, you'd select the dimension string and associate the parameter. And that's also an element if you, say, wanted to have a feature, I don't know, the length of the leg or the height or diameter, you would apply those parameters as well.
So once you've completed all of your different shapes, just don't forget to save your document. I hit save there. And load it into your project. I'm going to close it just to make life simple. And you do always want to overwrite the parameters, and that makes your life a lot easier. So now we've got our model here, and you can see it's a little funky looking, but and I actually left that grid in there, but I think I've decided I don't want the bottom half of the wings. I think it'll look nicer. You can control objects individually only a little bit. So, for example, this leg here, I cannot scale it, but I can rotate it just by clicking the rotate command, and you'll see it'll come around. If you're having trouble, again, certain shapes are going to be locked to a reference plane. You can just come in here and type in a new number. And Revit will be more than happy to move it for you. Okay, I think I'm going to move that up though. Go back down. And one thing to be aware of is that when you load it in to your project, it probably will tell you, hey, I'm displaying masses for you. Revit has an annoying habit of not always displaying them, though. So if you go to the Visibility and Graphics Overrides button, menu, whatever it's called, what you'll see, I'll just scroll down in the list, mass needs to be checked. So sometimes you'll work on your project and then you'll come back the next day and say, where did my model go? Everything's invisible. It's because this mass button is turned off. And that has to be in every view. So if I go to the floor plan view, I may or may not see those masses. So again, you'll come down here and turn it on. Anyway, what's nice about having your photo handy is that you can come in here in Revit and set up your camera view. I'll just go to View, 3D View, Camera. So in this case, I have a photograph looking at this angle. I think I also have one facing this angle and one facing this angle. So you would just click and drag like you normally do. The only trick is here, these objects, because of the way I drew them, they are a little bit large. So you sometimes have to really go and figure out where the objects are in your perspective view. And like before, you might say, "Gee, where did all the legs go?" So you'll have to go and turn on your masses. Sorry. Anyway, and then if your object is either too distorted or it somehow doesn't match the picture, I would recommend using the navigation wheel. Okay, let me zoom in on this a little bit. Click on the navigation wheel. The reason I like this is it makes it easier to have kind of incremental control. Okay, so maybe I'll zoom out, maybe I'll pan up and down a little, or zooming in more slowly using the walk tool. Again, it just kind of depends on how far away you think you are. And what you'll see happen is as you zoom in and out, it will flatten your image. You can also orbit it ever so slightly if you'd rather. Okay, and there you go. Now I've got an image that is roughly the right angle for my perspective photograph. And if I wanted to, I tend to just use the shaded view. And the reason is when I create my materials, I tell them to use the color of the render appearance. And I find that my machine slows down, especially when I'm using a Mac that is operating with parallels. For some of you, it may not be an issue, but if your machine is slowing down or getting crashy, I would absolutely stop using the realistic mode. So I like to check how this thing looks on the computer first. This is particularly fine for models where it's just standing outside. There's no electric lighting, which can slow your machine down. I'm just going to click the render button here. And what you'll see, usually the background option says sky and a few clouds. That's kind of the default background. A lot of you like to put an image in there. I'm not a big fan of that. What I like to do is render it with a transparent background. And I'm just going to click render and show you what I mean. The reason that I do that now, any image basically invisible. It'll be clear. And when I save the file, let's say I export it, I can save it as a PNG file, and that retains the transparency. Okay, so it's good to know, and it's also good to see kind of what you get, and that rendering obviously didn't take very long. Now, one trick is if you prefer to render on the cloud, it freaks out if you use a transparent background. So I would use a solid color, maybe white. Okay, and when you render that, you'll just have a white background. Anyway, the last thing that you need to do is render this puppy. And what you can do, we all love the Render in Cloud tool. Okay, so we'll go to Render in Cloud. And this has all of my options here. So one cool thing that you can do in this render menu, there's actually quite a few features in here. First of all, I can select multiple views in this menu just by checking in the drop-down list here. I like to use this alpha channel, this transparency channel. What this does is anywhere in your view that is basically empty, it leaves it empty. And this is true if you're looking out a window or anything transparent, looking through anything that's semi-transparent, I mean. It will leave that as semi-transparent or completely transparent.
So here I am. I've got my renderings finally, and don't they look nice? Oh, they look wonderful. And what you can do, obviously, as we know, if you render them at a low resolution and you like what you see, you can always re-render and change the size. The biggest thing is here when you're in the render menu online, you can type in a value for the pixel dimension. I believe 4000 is the maximum size. Anyway, you can also choose to render a transparent background or not. Again, this is the alpha channel that we saw earlier. And you can choose to give it some kind of background here. They tend to look kind of silly. So anyway, you'd click render there if you wanted to. And you can also adjust the menu. And again, these are probably things that you're familiar with. If you want to tweak the shadows, the exposure value, all those sorts of things, you can modify those. Anyway, and then you just download the image. Now, one cool thing is when you download it, you can tell it whether or not you want that transparent background. And sometimes you do want the white background. You'll see when you click that, it does tell you, oh, you only have these two file formats. So I'll download it as a PNG. And then let's go to good old Photoshop here, and I'll show you what we got. We have ourselves a handy little bus stop, and hopefully I got the hopefully I got the camera angle about right. We have learned a number of tools that are available for editing our object, and we will learn more photoshopping tools later on. But basically, this object you can resize it to try and get it kind of just right. And again, that's going to depend on your composition of your image. A few things that you can do once you've resized it. First of all, I'll just click check there. I'm on this bus stop layer. There are some editing tools that can help out. They're actually similar to in Adobe Illustrator. First of all, there's just the free transform tool, but then there are these other transform tools. I'm not going to go into every one, but they are similar to the Illustrator ones. The perspective one can make it look like it's in perspective a little bit more. You can alter the angles that it's at. You can also go, and if you go to some of these other ones, warp is a fun one. Here you can actually kind of warp the whole grid if something just went horribly wrong or you don't like the way it looks. Or here you can just make it wave to you. Hello. Okay, we won't do that. Anyway, I think this is fine for now. The other thing that you can do, your background layer here, this is the image, we don't want it to distract from our cool design. And so there's a couple of things you can do. First of all, it's locked because it was a photograph, and Photoshop tends to lock images. If you just double click on it, this will turn it into a layer called layer 0. And now we have some controls. We could change the opacity, but I don't like the way that looks. What I like to do is I like to come in and I use a hue saturation adjustment layer. What you'll notice is I was on this layer when I inserted that, so the hue saturation layer shows up right above this layer. And that's important because that affects layers below it. And I could drop the saturation down to make it kind of more grayscale. All right, and you see how my object starts to look a little bit nicer just because it shows it off a little bit more. You could also use other adjustments here. Brightness contrast is a good one. Just kind of wash it out a little bit. This is a pretty snowy image, so maybe that one's not going to work so good. Let's try a levels layer here. And what this can do, that's not really so good. We can try to adjust this to maybe wash out the background a little bit. Other things you can do, you can blur the background. That's a nice effect. Let me go down and select my background layer. I can select all and blur everything. And this is a filter here in the filter gallery. And a Gaussian blur tends to be a nice one. And you see here you get a nice preview, and oh, that's nice and blurry. It's kind of what happens when I take my glasses off. But, you know, I don't think I want to blur everything. So one thing you can do is just select certain areas. I'm going to select the area behind the bus stop here. Let me just deselect everything first. I'm just going to select the area kind of behind the bus stop. Maybe I'll even make sure to get the entire building here. I can add that selection. Of course, I don't need to blur the sky, but I also could blur the foreground too. Now, a nice little trick when you are blurring things is you can, first of all, make sure you know which layer you're on. You can also feather this selection. Just right-click on it and choose Feather. Now, how exactly much you feather it is kind of a matter of judgment, and also how detailed this image is. But that should be enough to kind of soften it a little bit. So now when I go to my blur menu, I'll go back here to blur, you can see it's just filtering what's behind and a little bit in the foreground. And then I can kind of tweak this to get just the effect that I want. You know, sometimes you don't want it to be super blurry, just a tad blurry. Okay. And you can see how that, again, kind of makes my object a little more prominent in the view. Another thing we like to do is add scale figures. And of course, we're all adept at finding them off of the internet. I chose one here that has a background image, but I just happened to, a background to the image, but I happened to like the figure because their arms were sticking out. You can use our ArchVision library as well. Anyway, I'm going to use this one because it matches my drawing. A quick way to select a person is to use this quick selection tool. That's why they call it quick. What this does is it kind of uses artificial intelligence a little bit, as a matter of fact, to kind of guess what it is that you want to select. See how I can drag down the leg, and it kind of says, oh, you want that whole leg. Oh, you want the shoe. You want the sole to the shoe. You can also click on different objects. You can also hold down the Alt key, and that will remove selections. And the removal process is also a smart process, a process where it is using this AI. And you can see I can come in here, and if I have a smaller kind of aperture to my selector, I can come in and grab the hands. Anyway, and then you can just Control C or Command C, copy and paste that guy in. Just make sure when you paste it in, it's at the top of the layer list. Anyway, so here it is at the top of my list, and it's an object that we can select and manipulate in different ways. Again, holding down Shift forces it to retain its dimension, and I can put the scale figure wherever I want, and I can choose whether or not, just by, let me just click check here. If I want her to show up behind the object, of course I can do that too. And I can use the arrow keys to nudge her. Of course, she's going to hurt her arm doing that. And, you can choose whether or not you want this to be blurred in some way or not. Sometimes a little bit of blur actually does help with, I don't know, making it look, I don't know, I don't want to say more realistic, but make it look a little more, I don't know, blended in. But again, that's entirely up to you. The other cool thing that we can do, we can use our transform tool. I'll just select the scale figure and go to my transform warp tool, and we can actually make her arms go in a different direction if we so desired. And again, you want to match the scale figure to the existing conditions of your site. And some people do like to drop the opacity down somewhat, although I'm not always sure it works real well, but it does soften it just a hair, and that allows it to kind of recede somewhat behind the object.